Well, hello folks, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to take a look at a very influential piece of gaming history. This is Blood Bowl First Edition, the game of fantasy football, published by Games Workshop way back in 1986. If you've been watching our content for a while, then you may recall that we played a fair amount of Blood Bowl 1988 on the channel, using the actual box set and minis that I purchased way back when. However, what I didn't realize in 1988 was that I was actually playing the second edition of the game, and that Blood Bowl First Edition had premiered 2 years earlier. And it just so happens that our good buddy Mark owns a copy of original Blood Bowl, which he kindly lent me so we can all bask in the glory of this very influential piece of tabletop gaming history. Now, before we dig into Blood Bowl First Edition, I feel compelled to mention that before this game even hit the shelves in 1986, TSR Hobbies published a game entitled Monsters of the Midway in the September 1982 issue of Dragon magazine, which allowed readers to play tabletop football using teams comprised of AD&D monsters such as bugbears, centaurs, dwarves, elves, giants, goblins, halflings, leprechauns, lycanthropes, minotaurs, and treants. Now, Monsters of the Midway was a hex-based game played using paper counters, and I have no idea if it influenced Blood Bowl in any way, but it certainly did exist. So the idea of fantasy creatures playing football had at least been floating around in the early 1980s. Anyway, 4 years after Monsters of the Midway was published, Games Workshop took their own stab at the concept, and as luck would have it, the Filmdag Miniatures channel on YouTube, if I'm pronouncing that right, not too long ago published an excellent interview with the original Blood Bowl designer Jervis Johnson, along with editor and project co-coordinator Mark Gascon, in which they discussed the game's first edition as well as the later editions in the decades that followed. So I was able to glean quite a bit of background from that, some of which I'll be paraphrasing here, but if you want to check out the full interview, it's definitely worth the time, so I would recommend it. Anyway, in the mid-1980s, Games Workshop was selling their Warhammer Fantasy Battle game, as well as RPGs and a number of board games, which is what Blood Bowl was initially pitched as, a board game that used slightly modified Warhammer rules to play American football using teams comprised of fantasy factions and creatures, as featured in Warhammer. Teams were usually, but not always, made up of players from a single faction, which included humans, dwarves, elves, halflings, dark elves, half-orcs, hobgoblins, and orcs. There were also special teams, which included the Chaos All-Stars, made up of lesser goblins and either ogres, troglodytes, or trolls, and the Champions of Death, comprised of skeletons and zombies, with the option to swap in a mummy or 4 ghouls. A team's players were represented, at least initially, by these cardstock stand-ups. If a player was knocked prone, you just turn them sideways in the stand. Unfortunately, there were no counters for elves, hobgoblins, or half-orcs. The rulebook actually says, sorry, we just couldn't fit them on the counter sheet. So if you wanted to field elves, you had to use the dark elf counters, and orc counters were used to represent the hobgoblins or half-orcs. Additional teams, such as knights and peasants, slann, and werewolves, were featured in the first edition's Death Zone expansion, which was published shortly after Blood Bowl really took off, surprising just about everyone. On the field, Blood Bowl combat was very similar to regular Warhammer combat, and Blood Bowl players had a stat line resembling the Warhammer stat line. There was a roll to hit, a roll to wound, and an armor save, just like in Warhammer. Though in Blood Bowl First Edition, if a player is reduced to 0 wounds, they need to roll on the official wound chart, which might result in a broken arm or leg, being KO'd or stunned, receiving a skull fracture, or even on-field death. Blood Bowl First Edition also incorporated non-Warhammer actions, such as tackling, dodging, and throwing, so the game was more than just a big brawl at center field. In terms of tone, Blood Bowl First Edition was inspired by, but not officially in, the Warhammer Fantasy universe, and as such could lean into cheeky satire and puns, which poked fun both at the razzmatazz of American football, as well as the high fantasy genre in general, taking tropes to the extreme. Regarding gameplay, Mark Gascon described Blood Bowl as Warhammer on a board, rather than a traditional board game. And Jervis Johnson said the game combined the tightness of the rules that you get with a square-based board game with the army building aspect you might find in a war game. He called it a fusion of the two things, and that the team roster was essentially an army list. With that in mind, here's a look at the Blood Bowl First Edition roster booklet, where the coaches could keep track of players, wounds, injuries, star player abilities, and such. Blood Bowl was apparently, to almost everyone's surprise, popular right out of the gate, and as I mentioned earlier, that led to the rapid release of the Death Zone expansion. There were also a few articles on Blood Bowl First Edition in White Dwarf magazine. White Dwarf 86 includes rules and stand-ups for the Skaven Scramblers, a sneaky Ratman team. White Dwarf issue 88 had rules for playing Judge Dredd characters in Blood Bowl, which is kind of odd, but Games Workshop was publishing a Judge Dredd RPG and a board game at the time, I believe, so maybe they were trying to get a bit more mileage out of the license. And here's an ad for some first edition Blood Bowl miniatures, which entered the picture once GW started seeing that the game had potential to be a driver for selling figures, which no doubt led the game to being rebooted just 2 years after its initial release. So by 1988, Blood Bowl had moved on to its second edition, which was a big boxed game with plastic figures and the famous polystyrene pitch, marketed as Astro Granite, which was apparently formed on a machine made for processing industrial packing material, and the equipment was rather rough on the material being formed, so a lot of Blood Bowl pitches were too damaged to sell to a retail audience, leading Astro Granite as a Blood Bowl pitch to be replaced. And 2 other tidbits I picked up from the Film Dag Miniatures interview. Apparently by the time Blood Bowl 2nd edition rolled around, some shops were complaining that it was too easy to sell and was diverting customers away from the Warhammer games. And there was also speculation that folks who play Blood Bowl these days typically don't play Warhammer or vice versa. Now I don't know if that's true or not. Please let me know what you think in the comments. I'd love to read your take on it. Okay folks, that's a wrap on our Blood Bowl 1st edition retrospective. Do you play Blood Bowl? And if so, what's your favorite team and or edition? Tell us all about it in the comments below. Thanks very much for joining us today. We're really glad you're here. Until we talk again, stay frosty out there, take care, and we'll see you next time.